All right. Okay, guys, welcome to Happy Hour version 2. We're talking about browsers today. We're going to try and move through a lot of material really fast. So I think what we want to do is hold like questions for twice throughout the hour. So I'm going to run through real quick like a history and like browser wars and stuff like that. And we'll do a question and answer if you have them. And if not, we'll move on to Becky's part of the presentation, which will be the second half. And then hopefully we'll have enough time for some questions and answers after that too. Okay? So, all right. So this is the first web browser. Kind of hilarious looking picture, but this is actually where it all started right here. This guy, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, was, we talked about him last week. He's the guy who came up with HTML and wrote the first web page and created the first web browser. So while he was a student at CERN, which is whatever the European Institute for Nuclear Research, he proposed the World Wide Web, which was the concept of hypertext and linking between different pages and stuff like that. Come on in, John, if you want to grab a seat or grab a beer. They're over here. Okay, so implemented the first successful HTTP communication between the server and the client in 1990. We talked about server-client stuff last week, so hopefully everybody's still familiar with what I mean by that. And so the very first web browser was this thing called the World Wide Web, ironically, and that's it. That's the very first one. That's World Wide Web. And he came up with that in 1991, and then in 94 he founded the W3C, which is the standards body. We're going to talk a little bit about web standards shortly, but basically it's sort of the higher level governmental kind of oversight, and if there was a government in charge of the internet. And they help sort of solidify standards and make sure that all browsers render things the same. Okay, so this is probably the granddaddy of all current modern web browsers. This is Mosaic, if anybody's familiar with that. This is a revolutionary browser. It was developed by the National Center for Supercomputing Applications and was released in 1993. It's widely credited with popularizing the World Wide Web, mostly because it was the first browser to support inline images. And by inline, I mean actually like images that is on the same page as the text. Prior to this, you had to click a link to open an image in a new window. So this was the first one that was able to sort of integrate it all into one page. It was discontinued in '97, and it was actually licensed by Microsoft and created the foundation for Internet Explorer 1.
It really doesn't look all that much different.
Frankly, it was way ahead of its time.
I mean, it's recognizable, all the functionality of it.
So speaking of recognizable, do you recognize this one?
Yeah.
All right, so this is probably about the time when all of us were getting into the web, or at least not the uber nerds. Pretty painful, right? Like this really brought me back when I found this image.
Completely awesome GIF animation.
Yep. Exactly. Which, if you recall, that was the best part of it. I used to look at the start for hours. Okay. Okay, so that was Netscape in like circa '94. It was originally codenamed Mozilla, which is where we get the name of the Mozilla Foundation and Mozilla Firefox and all that. It was also based on Mosaic. In fact, the lead developer for Mosaic, I think his name was Mark Andreessen. He is the guy who formed Netscape originally. The first full version was available in December of '94, and it was quickly the industry standard mostly because there was nothing else to compete with it. Mosaic was there, but it was more primitive than Netscape in '94 at least. So it was widely supported. Made some very important innovations in the web world, like on-the-fly rendering of page content. So what I mean by that is when you hit a web page, it would actually start displaying the content as the page was downloading more content, right? So what this meant, if you remember the days of dial-up, it would take like 20 minutes to load a single page. And prior to Netscape, you would have to wait for all the content to get downloaded before it would actually display anything for you. So it was a pretty painful and very slow process. So this was, believe it or not, a really revolutionary turn of events. They also implemented the first frames, wrote the first level of JavaScript implementation in a browser, and cookies. So these kind of proprietary features were very controversial at the time. There was a number of like privacy implications regarding cookies. I don't know if you recall, but back in the day, like everybody said, turn off your cookies because there's huge security concerns. Pretty hilarious now, but at the time that was a big deal. Yeah, okay, so if you don't know what a cookie is a basically a text file. Vanessa, there's beer over here and chairs, or you pull one in from out there. So anyway, so a cookie is basically a text file that stores data about your session on a website, right? So if you've already visited a website and the website wants to capture that information and say, oh, I remember you, you've been here before, and maybe present like a different illustration or a different image or something on the page to denote that, you would use a cookie to save that information. So basically all it is a text file that I as a web developer would store on your computer, and then the next time you come back I can say, oh, you have that file, so I know you've been here, and then I can customize your experience based on that. That's a cookie. And at the very core, it's a text file, right? So the privacy implications are very little, and in fact most of the controversy surrounding privacy implications in terms of cookies were related to commercial application of this data and using this data. Okay? So moving on, this is Internet Explorer 1. This shipped with Windows 95. Pretty nasty. We've come a long way since then. But for the last 12 years, it's been the most widely used browser. It was also based on Mosaic, i.e. Again, Microsoft had the foundation of IE. It had a peak usage of 95% in 2002 and 2003, and version 1 shipped with Windows 95. Basically, it also had a number of important innovations, made a bunch of headway in HTML, actually was the first browser to implement CSS, which is the styling syntax that we use to do like 90% of the styling work. They also implemented DOM, which is a big concept in terms of JavaScript. We'll talk about that in later lessons, but it's the document object model, and that's how things get rendered on the page. AJAX, we talked about that last week. That's the method of using JavaScript to communicate with the server behind the scenes without locking up your focus and replacing elements on the page in real time. They were the first to create that technology, and they actually are the first to implement favicons, which are the little bookmark icons. So when you save a bookmark or you see it in the URL address, which that's a pretty awesome advancement, I guess. So again, controversial proprietary features here. Many people were concerned that Microsoft was implementing features that would lock the world into proprietary solutions. Case in point, one of the biggest, most controversial things that Microsoft did was implement ActiveX controls into their web pages or into their web browser. And what that meant, basically, ActiveX is a framework on Windows that you use to modularize or componentize particular pieces of programming, i.e. to reuse them multiple times over. And the concept is actually pretty good. The only problem is ActiveX only exists on Windows computers, so everybody else who wasn't using Windows, who was trying to browse a website that had ActiveX plugins involved in there, was unable to actually view that rich functionality. So while they were able to push the envelope with the functionality, it was unfortunate that it was proprietary and nobody else could, play in that space. And then also, as a result of adding in ActiveX, there were a number of security vulnerabilities, hence the reason that there are so many viruses and stuff on Windows and Internet Explorer.